Halloween stories. Frankenstein. Belinda's Halloween. The Selfish Giant.
Hi, this is Greg Vaughn. I'll be reading Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. They called me a madman. They called me a dreamer, Victor said to himself. All throughout school, Victor had craved knowledge. He'd torn through books like a wolf, but he had never been enough for him. There were still mysteries of the universe he did not understand and things he did not know. These were questions that kept him awake at night and what forced him to shut himself away in his laboratory working late into the night. All those long hours spent in isolation were about to pay off as he stood over his newest creation. There, on a cold operation table, lay the pale green rotten fruit of his labors. Dr. Victor Frankenstein had stitched together bits and pieces of various dead bodies he had dug up at the local cemetery, and he had sewn them together into a giant, ghastly form. So obsessed was he with this project to reanimate the dead that he could not see what form his madness was taking. The creature stood at least 7 feet tall if it was an inch, with bulging muscles and black lips covering his yellow teeth. It was only after Victor had flipped that switch that brought the creature to life with a shower of sparks and lightning did he see the true face of his mistake. He screamed, he ran out of the room, leaving his creation to sit up and take his first bleary-eyed look at the world alone and scared. It roared in fear and Victor ran faster, locking himself into a closet and waiting for the monster to just go away. After what seemed like hours huddled in the dark, he opened the door and he peeked outside. The window was broken, and the monster was gone. "What have I done?" Victor said, slumping over at his desk. He cleaned up the mess and he tried to force the whole event from his mind. For a little while, it was easy, but soon there were rumors in town of a horrible giant creature living in the nearby woods. Victor knew this was none other than his creature. If anyone ever found out that it was he who made the beast, it would spell doom for his career and his family. He had no choice but to hunt his creature down and destroy it for good. Meanwhile, the creature learned the basics of life on its own in the woods: how to eat, how to sleep, how to survive. He learned to speak and write by hiding in the shadows of the trees while he followed along with a little girl who was receiving private tutoring out in her garden. He stole books while her back was turned until he was as well-read and well-spoken as any gentleman. Knees knocking, Victor stalked the streets late one night, but he was unsure what he would actually do if he happened upon the monster. He looked up and down the foggy, lantern-lit streets and completely missed a large shadow that came out from a dark corner behind him. "Father," the creature called out. Victor went pale and he gripped his shovel with sweaty palms. He turned around slowly and saw the all-too-familiar frame of his mistake. "Stay back!" He swung the shovel at no one in particular. "Put that down. You'll hurt yourself. Besides, you look ridiculous," the creature smiled humorously. "What would you know about that?" "Nothing." "And whose fault is that? You made me this way, and then you abandoned me, forcing me to live in the shadows like a monster." "You are a monster," Victor shouted. "No, Father. A monster is something you must choose to be, not something based on your appearance. You, Father, are the real monster. But don't worry, you will not see me again. I have decided to live far away in the woods, away from the unfair judgments of mankind." And then he was gone. Victor returned home, at first feeling that he had been lucky. However, as he thought on what the creature had said, he realized the world around him was still full of monsters, but was now without its only purely decent man.
Hi, I'm Ariane Smith, and I'll be reading Belinda's Halloween. Peter's got a sister. She's bigger than he. She likes to adventure and loves climbing trees. With glossy brown braids and emerald green eyes, Peter thinks one day she might reach to the skies. I could be an astronaut or a famous magician, become a starlet in a movie, or make cakes in a kitchen. And someday you might be just as tall as me. We could go sailing and discover the sea. "What would we find there?" asked Peter, concerned. "Why, Blackbeard the pirate," she answered with a smirk. "Blackbeard the pirate?" he said, looking stark. "Nah, just shark-infested waters when it gets dark." This was an image that caused Peter to shudder. What were these words his sister was able to utter? He didn't know that she was just teasing, a game that she sort of found really quite pleasing. Until one day, close to Halloween, Peter decided that Belinda was being sort of mean. "I'll show her," he thought to himself, and he went to the store and picked a costume off the shelf. He found one that looked oh so scary, for he knew that Belinda would be dressed up like a fairy. And later that night, when the spirits were about, he put on a mask with a very long snout. Then Peter looked in the mirror and started to giggle. If he shook his head, the ears would wiggle. Now Belinda herself was in great preparation, all excited about the upcoming celebration. When the moon rose and was high in the sky, they agreed to meet and go trick-or-treat. Now the time was right. Peter crept down the street, hid in the bushes and waited to meet his trickster sister and accomplish his feat. The moon was full, a real pale yellow, and Peter was dressed like a monster-like fellow. When through the door came not a fairy, but something much, much more scary. It had horns and fur and claw-like feet. It grimaced and groaned as it clomped down the street. The monsters, it seemed, were exactly the same. Peter and Belinda enjoying a game. Peter jumped out with a "Boo-ha-ha-ha," to which Belinda answered, "That's so la-dee-da." "So la-dee-da? Whatever do you mean? You copied my costume, or so it would seem." "Your costume? I thought of mine first." But just then Belinda started to burst with laughter and merriment and all things so jolly. Then Peter chimed in, realizing their folly, for each in their own way was ever so clever, both brother and sister, always and forever. The end.
This is Mark Thompson. I will be reading The Selfish Giant by Oscar Wilde. Every afternoon as they were coming home from school, the children used to play in the giant's garden. It was a lovely garden, with soft green grass and flowers like stars. The birds sat in the trees and sang so sweetly that the children used to stop their games in order to listen to them. "How happy we are!" they cried to each other. One day, the giant came back. He had been visiting his friend, the ogre, and had stayed with him for 7 years. But now he was determined to return to his own castle. And when he arrived, he was surprised to see the children playing in the garden.
"What are you doing here?"
he cried in a gruff voice, and the children ran away.
"My own garden is my own garden,"
said the giant.
"Anyone can understand that, and I'll allow nobody to play in it but myself."
So he built a high wall around it and put up a notice that said, "Trespassers will be prosecuted." He was a very selfish giant. The poor children now had nowhere to play. They tried to play on the road, but it was very dusty and full of hard stones, and they didn't like it. They wandered around the high wall when their lessons were over and talked about the beautiful garden inside. "How happy we were there," they said to each other. Then spring came, and all over the country there were little blossoms and little birds. But it remained winter time in the garden of the selfish giant. The birds did not care to sing in it, as there were no children, and the trees forgot to blossom. Once, a beautiful flower poked its head out from the grass, but when it saw the notice, it was so sorry for the children that it slipped back into the ground again. The only ones who were pleased were the snow and the frost.
"Spring has forgotten this garden,"
they cried.
so we'll live here all year round.
The snow covered up the grass with her great white cloak, and the frost painted all the trees silver. Then they invited the north wind to stay with them, and he came. He was wrapped in furs, and he roared around the garden and blew the chimneys down. "This is a delightful spot," he said. "We must ask Hail to visit." So the hail came too. Every day for 3 hours, he rattled the roof of the castle until the shingles fell off, his breath like ice.
I can't understand why spring is so late in coming this year,
said the selfish giant, as he sat at the window and looked out over his cold white garden.
I hope there will be a change in weather.
But the spring never came, nor the summer. The autumn brought golden fruit to every garden but the selfish giant's. So it was always winter there, and the north wind, the hail, the frost, and the snow danced around the bare trees. One morning, the giant was lying awake in his bed when he heard some lovely music. It was only a little bird singing outside his window, but it had been so long since he had heard a bird sing in his garden that it seemed to him the most beautiful music in the world. Then the hail stopped dancing over his head, and the north wind stopped roaring.
I believe spring has come at last,
said the giant, as he jumped out of bed and looked outside, where he saw the most wonderful sight. Through a little hole in the wall, the children had crept in, and they were sitting in the branches of the trees. In every tree he could see there was a little child, and the trees were so glad to have the children back again that they had covered themselves with blossoms and were waving their arms gently above the children's heads. The birds were twittering with delight, and the flowers were looking up through the green grass and laughing. It was a lovely scene, except that in one corner it was still winter. It was the farthest corner of the garden, and in it was standing a little boy. He was so small that he couldn't reach the branches, and he was crying bitterly. The poor tree was still quite covered in frost and snow, and it tried to bend its branches as low as he could, but the boy was too tiny to reach. The giant's heart melted as he looked out, and he was really very sorry for what he'd done.
How selfish I've been,
he said.
Now I know why spring wouldn't come. I'll put that poor little boy on top of the tree, and then I'll knock down the wall, and my garden will be the children's playground forever and ever.
So he crept downstairs and went out into the garden. But when the children saw him, they were so frightened that they all ran away, and it quickly became winter again. Only the little boy didn't run, because his eyes were too full of tears to see the giant coming. And so the giant inched up behind him and took him gently by the hand and lifted him up into the tree. And the tree blossomed at once, and the birds came to sing on it, and the little boy flung his arms around the giant's neck in thanks. And the other children, when they saw the giant was no longer mean or selfish, came running back, and with them came spring.
It's your garden now, little children,
said the giant, and he took an axe and knocked down the wall. And when the people walked by on their way to town, they found the giant playing with the children in the most beautiful garden they'd ever seen, as he did every afternoon from that day on. The end.